There's a moment in every person's life when they realize the walls around them have become a prison. For 73-year-old Robert Chin, that moment came on a Tuesday morning in March, standing in his kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands. The house was silent. It had been silent for years. 5 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a garden he no longer tended, and rooms he no longer entered. His children had grown and scattered across the country like seeds on the wind. His wife, Eleanor, had been gone for 2 years. And Robert stood there, in the house they built together, realizing he was drowning in memories while starving for connection. What he did next would baffle his family, concern his friends, and ultimately reveal something profound about what it means to be alive. He sold his house to complete strangers. And then he asked if he could stay. If you've ever felt trapped by the very things that were supposed to set you free, you need to hear this story. Hit that like button and subscribe, because what happened next will change how you think about home, family, and what we're really searching for in this life. Robert Chin spent 42 years building a life inside 4 walls and a mortgage. He was an architect by trade, which made the house on Maple Street something of a masterpiece. Every corner had been designed with intention. The kitchen faced east to catch the morning light. The living room had built-in bookshelves because Eleanor loved to read. There was a window seat in the master bedroom where she would sit with her tea and watch the neighborhood wake up. The house was filled with these small acts of love, calcified into wood and stone and glass. But architecture, Robert learned, cannot account for time. It cannot design around loss. When Eleanor died after a short and vicious battle with pancreatic cancer, the house that had once felt alive began to feel like a mausoleum. Her teacup still sat on the windowsill. Her books remained alphabetized on the shelves. Robert found himself walking through rooms as if they were exhibits in a museum dedicated to a life that had ended. He would open closets and find her sweaters. He would hear phantom footsteps on the stairs at night. The house remembered her in ways that were both comforting and excruciating. His children visited, of course. Michael came from Seattle every few months. Sarah made the drive from Chicago when she could. They would sit in the living room and make conversation that felt like they were all reading from a script. They asked about his health, his hobbies, whether he was eating properly. They never asked the question that mattered. Are you okay? Are you lonely? Are you slowly disappearing inside this beautiful house we grew up in? Robert never volunteered the answer because he knew what would come next. The concerned looks. The gentle suggestions about assisted living or moving closer to one of them. The unspoken truth that he had become a problem to be managed rather than a father to be known. So he stopped calling as often. He let the visits spread further apart. He convinced himself that independence was the same thing as strength, that needing nothing from anyone was a form of dignity. He was wrong. Independence without connection isn't freedom. It's exile. And Robert Chin was living in exile inside a house that had once been full of laughter, arguments, birthday parties, and the messy, beautiful chaos of family life. Now it was just square footage and silence. The idea came to him not as a revelation, but as a quiet knowing. Robert was sitting in his study, looking at the property tax statement, calculating how much money was flowing out to maintain a house he barely inhabited. He thought about the heating bills for rooms he never entered, the lawn service for a yard he never enjoyed, the insurance premiums protecting possessions he no longer cared about. And somewhere in the middle of all that arithmetic, a question formed. What if I'm doing this wrong? What if the house isn't supposed to serve me anymore? What if I'm supposed to serve something else? He spent 3 weeks researching. He looked into communal living arrangements, intergenerational housing models, co-housing communities. He discovered that across the world, people were experimenting with different ways of building home, not just as property, but as ecosystem, not just as investment, but as invitation. The more he read, the more certain he became. He didn't need to leave his house. He needed to share it. Not with family out of obligation. Not with tenants in some sterile landlord arrangement. But with people who might need what he had to offer, in exchange for what he desperately needed. Presence. Purpose. The simple gift of not being alone. When Robert first approached his real estate agent with the idea, she thought he'd lost his mind. He wanted to sell the house but negotiate a clause in the contract that would allow him to remain as a permanent resident in one bedroom. He would pay nominal rent. He would maintain his independence. But he would be part of a household again. Part of the daily rhythm of other lives. His agent tried to talk him out of it. His lawyer raised concerns about legal complications. His children, when he finally told them, reacted exactly as he'd feared. Anger. Confusion. Accusations that he was being taken advantage of or suffering from early dementia. Michael flew out to intervene. Sarah called every day for a week. But Robert had made up his mind. He wasn't running away from his life. He was running toward a different version of it. The listing went up in June. For bedroom, 2.5-bath colonial in a good school district. Below market price. With one unusual stipulation. The seller wishes to retain a bedroom and continue living in the home. The agent warned him it would take months to find buyers willing to agree to such bizarre terms. She was wrong. Within 2 weeks, Robert received an offer. From a young family named the Kowalskis. David and Maria Kowalski were 34 and 32 respectively. They had 2 children, Emma, who was 6, and Lucas, who was 3. They were both teachers, which meant they had more love than money and more hope than square footage. They'd been searching for a house for over a year, watching prices climb beyond their reach month after month. When their agent showed them Robert's listing, they read the stipulation about the live-in grandfather, and looked at each other across the kitchen table. David spoke first. What if this is exactly what we need? What if this is the universe offering us something we didn't know how to ask for? They met Robert on a Saturday afternoon in July. He gave them a tour of the house, showing them the updates he'd made over the years, the quirks only a longtime resident would know. The basement door that stuck in humid weather. The bedroom with the best afternoon light. The spot in the backyard where Eleanor used to plant tomatoes every spring. Emma and Lucas ran through the halls with the unself-conscious joy of children imagining new kingdoms to rule. Maria watched Robert watch the kids, and she saw something in his face that made her decision. Not pity, not uncertainty, but a kind of gentle longing. The look of someone who remembered what it felt like when a house was full. They made an offer that night. Not because the price was good, though it was. Not because the house was perfect, though it nearly was. But because Maria had grown up in the Philippines in a household where grandparents and aunts and cousins all lived under one roof. She understood something that American culture had largely forgotten. That isolation masquerading as independence was making everyone miserable. That the nuclear family, sealed off in its own suburban fortress, was starving for the very thing it had sacrificed in the name of privacy. Connection across generations. Wisdom exchanged for wonder. The particular alchemy that happens when the very old and the very young share space and time. The closing happened in August. Robert moved his belongings into what used to be Sarah's bedroom. He kept his favorite chair, his desk, his books, his photographs. Everything else he gave away or sold. He had never felt lighter. The Kowalskis moved in on a blazing hot weekend. And Robert helped David carry boxes up the stairs. Maria made sandwiches for everyone. Emma appointed herself in charge of showing Grandpa Robert, as she'd already started calling him, where everything was going to go. And just like that, the house on Maple Street woke up. The first few months were an adjustment. There were negotiations about noise levels and kitchen use and privacy boundaries. There were moments of awkwardness when Robert felt like he was intruding on family time. And moments when the Kowalskis worried they were imposing on his space. But slowly, organically, a rhythm emerged. Robert started making coffee every morning because he was up earliest. Maria started setting a place for him at dinner, because it felt strange not to. David discovered that Robert knew everything about the house's various systems, and could fix things David would have had to call a professional for. Emma discovered that Robert knew how to draw buildings and could teach her. Lucas discovered that Robert would read him the same book 17 times in a row without complaint. What grew between them wasn't obligation. It was something more subtle and more sustaining. It was the everyday intimacy of shared life. Robert would hear Lucas crying in the night, and feel a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years, knowing Maria and David could rest for a few extra minutes because he was there. Maria would leave a plate of dinner warming in the oven on nights she knew Robert had been alone all day. David would knock on Robert's door when he needed advice about work or life. or the particular challenges of being a father in a world that felt increasingly uncertain. And Robert would offer what he had. Not answers. Just presence. The steadying force of someone who had lived long enough to know that most things pass. And the things that don't pass are the things that matter. The house transformed. Not physically, but atmospherically. There were toys in the living room again. There were voices in the hallway. There were arguments and laughter, and the particular chaos of children growing up. Robert found himself cooking again, something he hadn't done since Eleanor died. He started tending the garden, teaching Emma the names of plants. He began sketching again, filling notebooks with designs for treehouses and fantasy castles that Emma would narrate into existence. The square footage hadn't changed. The walls were the same walls. But the house had become something it had never been before. A true home. Not in the sentimental greeting card sense, but in the deeper, more ancient sense. A place where people took care of each other not because they had to, but because they got to. When Michael and Sarah finally visited, months after the sale, they came prepared for disaster. They expected to find their father diminished, taken advantage of, living as some kind of charity case in his own former home. What they found instead confused them. They found their father more alive than he'd been in years. They found him playing chess with Emma in the living room. They found him helping David install a new light fixture. They found him belonging to something again. Sarah cried in the kitchen, though she couldn't explain why. Michael sat with his father on the back porch and asked the question he should have asked 2 years ago. "Dad, are you happy?" And Robert answered honestly, "I am. More than I've been in a very long time." The truth is, Robert hadn't given up his house. He'd reclaimed it. He'd understood something that most people spend their entire lives missing. That ownership without purpose is just possession. That space without connection is just emptiness. That you can have every material comfort and still be desperately, existentially poor. What Robert had traded, in selling his house but staying in it, was control for community. Autonomy for belonging. The illusion of independence for the reality of interdependence. And in that trade, he'd found something the culture had promised him he'd lose. His dignity. His relevance. His reason for waking up in the morning. The Kowalskis had gained something too. They had a home they could afford, yes. But more than that, they had help. They had wisdom. They had someone who cared about their children not as a job but as a joy. They had intergenerational wealth of a kind that can't be measured in equity or assets. They had the wealth of experience, of perspective, of a life fully lived offering guidance to lives still unfolding. David and Maria both worked demanding jobs. Having Robert in the house meant they could breathe. It meant someone was there when the kids got home from school. It meant they weren't doing it alone. And the children. Emma and Lucas were growing up with something increasingly rare. A grandparent who wasn't an occasional visitor but a daily presence. Someone who had time. Who wasn't rushed. Who could answer questions and tell stories and model what it looks like to grow old with grace and purpose. They were learning, without knowing they were learning, that family is not just blood. That home is not just ownership. That the best lives are the ones we build together, across generations, in defiance of the isolation the modern world insists is freedom. Robertson is 75 now. He still lives on Maple Street, in the house he designed with his wife 4 decades ago. The deed has someone else's name on it. The mortgage is someone else's responsibility. But the home, in every way that matters, belongs to all of them. He has dinner with the Kowalskis most nights. He helps Emma with her math homework. He takes Lucas to the park. He fixes things that break and offers counsel when asked. And in return, he is not alone. He is not forgotten. He is not a problem to be managed or a burden to be shouldered. He is essential. He is family. This story is not a prescription. Robert's solution won't work for everyone, and it shouldn't have to. But it reveals something we've lost in our obsession with independence, our worship of self-sufficiency, our insistence that needing others is weakness. We've built a culture that glorifies isolation, and then wonders why everyone is so lonely. We've created systems that separate young from old, family from neighbor, individual from community, and then we're shocked when people feel adrift. We've convinced ourselves that the goal is to need nothing from anyone, and in achieving that goal, we've made ourselves desperately, quietly miserable. Robert's gift wasn't his house. It was his willingness to admit that the life he was living wasn't working, that the independence he'd achieved was killing him, that he needed people, and that needing people wasn't failure. It was the most human thing in the world. The Kowalskis' gift wasn't their acceptance of his offer. It was their recognition that they needed him too. That raising children in isolation was harder than it had to be. That wealth isn't just financial. That sometimes the best inheritance is presence, not property. The house on Maple Street is full again. Not with ghosts of the past, but with the vibrant, messy, beautiful present. With laughter and arguments and homework and dinner and all the small, sacred moments that make a life. Robert gave away his house and found his home. He sold his property and bought his purpose. And in doing so, he discovered what too many people learn too late. That the things we cling to most tightly are often the things keeping us from what we actually need. That sometimes you have to let go of everything to find out what really matters. And that home isn't a place you own. It's a life you share.